October 15th, 1946. The crisp autumn air carries the scent of burnt wood and concrete dust through the skeletal remains of Tokyo. In a makeshift administrative building near Hibiya Park, fluorescent lights flicker against walls, still bearing scorch marks from the great firebombing 17 months prior. The sound of typewriter keys echoes through corridors where dozens of Japanese women in faded military uniforms sit hunched over desks, processing the endless paperwork of a nation's surrender. Their uniforms, once symbols of imperial pride, now hang loose on frames weakened by months of rationed meals. The olive-drab wool, designed for a war that promised glory, has become threadbare testimony to defeat. These women represented the forgotten remnants of Japan's wartime mobilization, members of the Women's Volunteer Corps, the National Defense Women's Association, and various auxiliary units that had once served the emperor with unwavering devotion. By the war's end in August 1945, over 6 million Japanese women had been mobilized into military and quasi-military roles, their lives transformed from traditional domestic spheres into the machinery of total war. They had served as communications operators, factory supervisors, air raid wardens, and administrative personnel in a military apparatus that had stretched across the Pacific. Now, in the autumn of 1946, they found themselves processing the documentation of their own nation's dismantlement under American occupation. The transformation had been as swift as it was devastating. Where once they had worn their military badges with pride, believing themselves guardians of the sacred homeland, they now faced a reality that shattered every foundation of their existence. The emperor they had served as a living god had announced Japan's surrender in a voice they barely recognized. Frail, human, mortal. The military they had supported had not brought the promised victory, but rather the most complete defeat in Japanese history. Cities lay in ruins, millions were homeless, and the very fabric of their society was being rewoven by foreign hands. Staff Sergeant Michiko Tanaka adjusts her worn military jacket for the 100th time that morning, trying to conceal the torn lining that exposes itself whenever she raises her arms. At 24, she had volunteered for the Women's Auxiliary Service Corps in 1943, filled with the fervor of a nation convinced of its divine mission. She had trained other women in radio operations, had organized air raid drills in her hometown of Osaka, had written letters of encouragement to soldiers fighting in Burma and Luzon. Her uniform had been perfectly pressed then, her insignia polished to mirror brightness. Now, as she sorts through demobilization papers, each document represents another piece of the world she once knew crumbling away. The shortage of basic necessities in post-war Japan was staggering. American intelligence reports from the period documented that textile production had fallen to 12% of pre-war levels. Cotton imports had ceased entirely during the war's final years, and wool production had been redirected to military blankets and equipment. The women who had served in military capacities found themselves in a peculiar situation. They possessed uniforms that marked them as participants in a defeated regime, yet they had no civilian clothes to replace them. Many had donated their peacetime clothing to the war effort years earlier, following government campaigns that urged citizens to contribute everything to the imperial cause. The morning of October 15th begins like any other in the administrative center, until the sound of American voices in the hallway announces something different. 3 women from the American Red Cross, accompanied by wives of occupation officers, wheel in large cardboard boxes labeled LARA, licensed agencies for relief in Asia. The contents represent part of a massive humanitarian effort that would eventually distribute over 33 million pounds of relief supplies to Japan between 1946 and 1952. But for the Japanese women hunched over their desks, these boxes contain something more precious than statistical measures of aid. They contain dignity. What the Japanese women had expected from their American conquerors was harsh retribution. Wartime propaganda had filled their minds with images of brutal occupiers who would exact terrible revenge for Pearl Harbor, for the Bataan Death March, for years of Pacific warfare. They had been taught that defeat would mean enslavement, humiliation, the complete destruction of their way of life. Many had prepared for death rather than surrender. Some had even received instructions on how to use bamboo spears against American invaders, while others had been trained to commit collective suicide rather than face occupation. Instead, they encountered something that their military training had never prepared them for: kindness from the enemy. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, wife of a U.S. Army colonel, opens the first box with practiced efficiency. She had organized similar distributions in liberated European cities. But there was something different about the silence that fell over this room. In London and Paris, relief recipients had maintained a defeated but defiant dignity. Here, she sensed something deeper, a complete psychological collapse of everything these women had believed about the world. The first item she withdraws is a navy blue wool dress, American-made, with pearl buttons and a modest collar. It had been donated by a department store in Cleveland, part of a nationwide collection drive that had gathered clothing from American women for their former enemies across the Pacific. Asterisk, the psychological impact of receiving gifts from American women represented a fundamental challenge to everything these Japanese women had been taught about their enemies. According to their wartime indoctrination, Americans were materialistic barbarians lacking the spiritual purity that defined Japanese civilization. They had been told that American women were weak, corrupted by luxury, incapable of the self-sacrifice that Japanese women demonstrated daily. Yet here were American women who had given up their own possessions to help former enemies in their time of need. Sergeant Tanaka approaches the distribution table hesitantly, her worn shoes making soft sounds against the concrete floor. The American woman, she learns later her name is Mrs. Patterson, smiles and holds up a green wool skirt with a matching sweater. "This should fit you," she says in halting Japanese, having learned a few phrases from occupation language guides. The kindness in her voice breaks something inside Tanaka that military discipline had held rigid for 3 years. For the first time since the surrender, she feels tears forming in her eyes. Asterisk, the clothing itself represented more than mere fabric and thread. It symbolized American abundance in a way that these women could never have imagined. During the war years, Japan had implemented strict rationing that limited each person to 1 new piece of clothing per year. Luxury items like silk stockings and leather shoes had disappeared entirely from civilian life. Even military uniforms were being made from substitute materials by 1944, with paper and wood pulp replacing cotton and wool. The idea that American women could casually donate high-quality clothing to former enemies spoke to a level of material prosperity that seemed almost miraculous to women who had been darning the same stockings for 3 years. As each woman receives her items, a dress here, a coat there, sometimes undergarments that represented the first new intimate apparel they would own in years, something remarkable happens in that concrete room. The rigid military posture they had maintained throughout the defeat begins to soften. Shoulders that had been held straight through bombing raids and surrender ceremonies finally allow themselves to slump. Hands that had signed demobilization papers with stoic efficiency now tremble as they touch fabric that feels impossibly soft against skin roughened by wartime soap shortages. Asterisk, the transformation was not merely physical but profoundly ideological. These women had been raised in a culture that emphasized collective sacrifice for the greater good of the nation. Individual desires, particularly for material comfort, were considered selfish and unworthy. The concept of conspicuous consumption was not just foreign but morally reprehensible. Yet here were American women demonstrating a form of generosity that transcended national boundaries, offering material comfort to strangers who had recently been enemies. Lieutenant Keiko Yamamoto, a former communications officer who had coordinated radio transmissions between island bases in the Pacific, holds a pale blue dress against her frame. The fabric, real cotton, not the wood pulp substitute she had grown accustomed to, feels like a revelation. She remembers the last civilian dress she owned, sold to a government scrap drive in 1944 to support the war effort. She had folded it carefully, kissed it goodbye, and told herself that personal vanity was a small sacrifice for the emperor's victory. Now, receiving this gift from an American woman whose husband might have fought against her own compatriots, the complexity of human nature overwhelms her carefully constructed worldview. Asterisk, the sound that would remain etched in the memories of the American women distributing clothing was not what they expected. It was not gratitude expressed in polite Japanese phrases, nor the reserved acceptance they had encountered in other relief distributions. Instead, it was the sound of crying, deep, profound sobbing that seemed to come from places deeper than hunger or cold. It was the sound of ideological certainty collapsing, of worldviews rebuilt in the span of moments, of former enemies discovering their shared humanity through the simple act of giving and receiving. Mrs. Dorothy Whitman, a Red Cross volunteer from Michigan, had expected this distribution to be routine. She had participated in similar efforts in war-torn European cities, where the rhythm of relief work had become almost mechanical. Assess needs, distribute supplies, document results, move to the next location. But as she watches a Japanese officer hold a simple cotton blouse to her chest and begin to weep, she realizes she is witnessing something far more significant than material aid. She is seeing the moment when the abstractions of war, enemy, ally, victory, defeat, give way to the fundamental recognition of shared humanity. The documentation from Lara and American Red Cross reports of this period reveals that Japanese recipients were often overwhelmed by the quality and quantity of American donations. Items that Americans considered routine, cotton underwear, wool socks, leather shoes, represented luxuries that had been unavailable in Japan for years. A single pair of nylon stockings, carelessly discarded by an American woman cleaning out her closet, might represent more material wealth than a Japanese woman had seen in months. Corporal Yuki Sato, who had trained as a military nurse and spent the final year of the war treating casualties in increasingly inadequate conditions, receives a winter coat. It is deep red wool with a fur collar, the kind of garment she had only seen in American movies before the war. As she slips it on, feeling its weight and warmth, she remembers the winter of 1945 when she had wrapped herself in newspapers to stay warm. The contrast is so profound that she cannot process it rationally. Instead, she simply stands there, tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by the sensation of being warm. The psychological documentation from occupation authorities noted that many Japanese women experienced what modern psychology would recognize as cognitive dissonance when confronted with American generosity. Their training had prepared them for harsh treatment, perhaps even execution. Instead, they found themselves recipients of charity from women who shared their gender, their concerns about clothing and appearance, their basic human needs for warmth and dignity. The boxes seem bottomless, dresses in colors that had been forbidden during wartime, bright reds and yellows that violated sumptuary laws designed to maintain wartime austerity, shoes with heels that served no practical purpose but made the wearer feel feminine, lipstick and face powder that spoke to a concept of individual beauty that had been subsumed into collective duty for 3 years. Each item represents not just material improvement, but the possibility of individual identity in a culture that had demanded complete subsumption to the state. What struck American observers most profoundly was not the gratitude of the Japanese women that had been expected, but their apparent surprise that such kindness was possible. Military intelligence reports from the period note that many Japanese civilians seemed genuinely shocked that Americans would provide aid rather than punishment. The concept of treating former enemies with magnanimity was so foreign to their experience that it required a complete recalibration of their understanding of international relations. As the afternoon progresses, the transformation in the room becomes visible. Women who had arrived in shapeless, faded military uniforms now stand in colorful dresses and skirts. The change is not merely aesthetic but psychological. Postures straighten not with military discipline, but with the confidence that comes from feeling appropriately clothed. Conversations that had been conducted in the clipped tones of military necessity now include laughter, the first genuine laughter heard in this building since the surrender. The symbolic power of clothing in this context cannot be overstated. For 3 years, these women had worn uniforms that identified them as servants of the state, their individual identities subsumed into their roles as cogs in the military machine. The civilian clothing they now received represented the possibility of individual identity, of personal choice, of a life defined by something other than military duty. Mrs. Patterson watches as Sergeant Tanaka models her new green outfit for her colleagues. The Japanese woman's smile, the first she has displayed all day, transforms her face completely. In that moment, the American woman sees not a former enemy or a recipient of charity, but simply another woman delighting in new clothes. The universality of that female experience, the pleasure of wearing something beautiful and well-fitting, transcends nationality, politics, and the bitter memories of war. The American women distributing clothing were themselves transformed by the experience. Many had lost sons, husbands, or brothers in the Pacific War. They had approached this relief work as a duty, perhaps even a burden. Seeing the profound impact of their donations on women, who had recently been enemies, challenged their own preconceptions about the nature of international conflict and human connection. By late afternoon, the last box has been emptied. The Japanese women, now dressed in American clothes, begin the process of folding their military uniforms. Some handle the garments with residual respect. They had, after all, worn them in service to what they believed was a sacred cause. Others treat them with barely concealed distaste, eager to consign reminders of defeat to the past. But all of them fold the uniforms carefully, placing them in neat stacks that will be collected for conversion to civilian purposes or simple disposal. The historical record shows that many of these military uniforms were eventually recycled into civilian clothing during Japan's textile shortage. The wool was unraveled and rewoven into new garments, the buttons and insignia removed and melted down for other purposes. In a very literal sense, the symbols of Japanese militarism were transformed into the building blocks of peaceful reconstruction. As the American women prepare to leave, loading their empty boxes back onto the trucks, they are approached by small groups of Japanese women who bow deeply in the formal style that had once been reserved for superiors in the military hierarchy. But there is something different about these bows. They are expressions of genuine gratitude rather than mere obligation. Mrs. Whitman, who speaks no Japanese beyond basic greetings, finds herself embraced by Lieutenant Yamamoto. No words are exchanged, but the meaning is clear. The transformation these women experienced in a single afternoon would resonate through their lives and the lives of their families for generations. Many would later describe this day as the beginning of their psychological recovery from the war. Not the formal surrender ceremony, not the emperor's radio address, not the sight of American troops marching through Tokyo, but the moment when former enemies demonstrated kindness rather than conquest. The typewriters fall silent as the last of the administrative work is completed for the day. The Japanese women, now dressed in American clothing, prepare to return to their homes, many of which are temporary shelters in schools or government buildings. They will face the same material shortages, the same uncertain future, the same challenge of rebuilding their lives in a defeated nation. But they will face these challenges wearing clothes that represent not just physical warmth, but the possibility that former enemies can become friends, that national hatreds can give way to human compassion. In the weeks and months that followed, as more relief supplies arrived from America and other allied nations, the psychological impact of that first distribution would prove as significant as its material benefits. The Japanese women who had received clothing from their former enemies became ambassadors for a new understanding of international relations, one based on mutual aid rather than conquest, on recognition of shared humanity rather than emphasis on national differences. The concrete building returns to its usual quiet as the evening shift takes over the endless paperwork of occupation and reconstruction. But something has changed in that space, something that will influence every subsequent interaction between American and Japanese personnel. The abstract concepts of victory and defeat, occupier and occupied, have been complicated by the simple human act of sharing clothing. In a world divided by ideology and scarred by war, women on both sides of the Pacific have discovered that their fundamental needs, for warmth, for dignity, for the simple pleasure of wearing something beautiful, transcend the artificial boundaries that politicians and generals draw on maps. The clothing distributed that day would wear out within a few years, replaced by Japanese-made garments as the textile industry recovered and the economy stabilized. But the psychological impact would endure for decades. Many of the Japanese women who received American clothing would later describe the experience as a turning point in their understanding of the world. Some would become advocates for international cooperation. Others would simply remember the day when former enemies became friends through the simple act of sharing. Mrs. Patterson returns to her quarters in the American compound that evening and writes a letter to her sister in Cleveland. She describes the tears, the gratitude, the profound human moment that transcended politics and nationality. She mentions that several of the dresses were ones her sister had donated, and that she had watched Japanese women wear them with obvious joy. The letter concludes with a reflection that would prove prophetic. I think we may have won more hearts today with boxes of clothing than we ever could with all our military victories. Perhaps this is how real peace is built, not through treaties and occupations, but through simple human kindness. The broader historical context of this clothing distribution extends far beyond its immediate humanitarian impact. It represented part of a larger American strategy, sometimes conscious, sometimes unconscious, to win the peace in Japan through demonstration of democratic values rather than mere military dominance. The Marshall Plan in Europe operated on similar principles, but the personal, individual nature of clothing donations created psychological bonds that formal aid programs could not replicate. In the months that followed, similar distributions would occur throughout occupied Japan. American women, both military wives and civilian volunteers, would organize clothing drives in their home communities, shipping thousands of pounds of garments across the Pacific. Japanese women would write thank you letters, often in carefully practiced English expressing gratitude that went far beyond mere material appreciation. These exchanges would create networks of communication that would persist long after the formal end of the occupation. The economic dimension of American aid to Japan, including the clothing donations, would prove crucial to the country's recovery. But the psychological dimension, the demonstration that former enemies could treat each other with dignity and generosity, may have been even more significant in creating the foundation for the post-war U.S. Japan alliance. The women who cried when they received American clothing would raise children who grew up understanding that international conflicts could end in friendship rather than perpetual enmity. Sergeant Tanaka returns to her small apartment that evening wearing her new green wool outfit. Her elderly mother, who had lost 2 sons in the war and harbored deep resentment toward Americans, is startled by her daughter's appearance. As Tanaka explains the day's events, her mother's expression changes from suspicion to wonder. The concrete reality of American generosity, embodied in the well-made clothing her daughter wears, challenges assumptions that had been reinforced by years of propaganda and personal loss. The ripple effects of such personal interactions would prove impossible to quantify but essential to understand. Family conversations around dinner tables, neighborhood discussions among women hanging laundry, casual exchanges in market lines, all would be influenced by the lived experience of American kindness. The abstract concept of democracy, promoted through official occupation programs, gained credibility through the concrete demonstration of democratic values in action. Winter arrives early in 1946, and the American clothing proves its practical as well as psychological value. Japanese women who had expected to face another season of inadequate heating and insufficient clothing instead find themselves warm and appropriately dressed. The wool coats and sweaters distributed by American women represent the difference between mere survival and basic comfort. But more importantly, they represent the possibility that the world can be rebuilt on foundations of mutual aid rather than mutual destruction. The documentation from this period reveals that American officials were sometimes surprised by the intensity of Japanese gratitude for what Americans considered routine charity. The cultural differences in gift-giving traditions meant that Japanese recipients experienced a profound sense of obligation that went far beyond the material value of the items received. This sense of obligation would later manifest itself in various ways, from individual acts of kindness toward American personnel to broader cultural shifts that embraced American-style democracy and capitalism. As 1946 turns to 1947, the transformation of these Japanese women becomes visible in ways that extend far beyond clothing. Many use their experience receiving aid to organize relief efforts for other Japanese civilians. Former military officers apply their organizational skills to reconstruction projects rather than military objectives. The hierarchy and discipline that had once served imperial expansion now serve democratic reconstruction. The symbolic power of the clothing, American-made garments worn by former enemies, would echo through the broader cultural transformation of post-war Japan. Fashion, which had been subordinated to military necessity during the war years, would emerge as a powerful form of individual expression and international communication. The Japanese women who first wore American dresses would later embrace American styles, creating a visual representation of cultural exchange that would influence everything from daily fashion choices to formal diplomatic ceremonies. The administrative building where the clothing distribution took place would eventually be demolished and replaced by a modern office complex. But the women who worked there in 1946 would carry the memory of that October afternoon for the rest of their lives. In their testimonies recorded decades later for oral history projects, they would describe not just the material impact of receiving clothing, but the emotional and psychological transformation that began when former enemies demonstrated kindness rather than conquest. The historical significance of these personal interactions extends beyond their immediate humanitarian impact. They represent a crucial element in the successful transformation of Japan, from militaristic enemy to democratic ally. The contrast between Japanese expectations of harsh treatment and the reality of American generosity created psychological conditions that made other occupation reforms more acceptable and effective. Mrs. Patterson would remain in Japan until 1949, participating in dozens of similar relief distributions throughout the country. In her final report to Red Cross headquarters, she would describe the clothing program as one of the most successful initiatives of the entire occupation period, not because of its material impact, which was significant, but because of its psychological effects, which were immeasurable. She would conclude, "We gave them dresses and coats, but what we really gave them was hope." The women who cried when they received American clothing would go on to live full lives in a transformed Japan. Some would marry American servicemen and immigrate to the United States, becoming part of the 45,000 Japanese war brides who would cross the Pacific in the post-war years. Others would remain in Japan, but maintain correspondence with American friends, creating personal bonds that transcended national boundaries. Many would become advocates for international understanding, drawing on their personal experience of transformation through kindness. Sergeant Tanaka would eventually leave government service and open a small dress shop in Osaka, specializing in American-style clothing for Japanese women who wanted to embrace international fashion. She would often tell customers about the day she received her first American dress, describing it as the moment she understood that former enemies could become friends. Her shop would prosper during Japan's economic miracle, serving customers who shared her appreciation for the beauty and quality of American-made clothing. The broader historical narrative of post-war reconstruction often focuses on economic aid, political reform, and military alliance. But the human dimension, represented by women crying over gifts of clothing, reveals the personal and emotional foundations that made larger transformations possible. The success of the U.S.-Japan alliance, which would become one of the most important strategic relationships of the Cold War period, rested not just on shared interests, but on shared experiences of mutual respect and generosity. In the end, the boxes of clothing distributed on that October afternoon in 1946 represented something more powerful than material aid or even humanitarian gesture. They represented the possibility that human kindness could transcend the artificial boundaries of nationality and ideology. They demonstrated that former enemies could choose friendship over perpetual conflict, that women separated by culture and language could recognize their shared humanity, that the cycles of war and revenge could be broken by simple acts of generosity. The tears shed by Japanese women receiving American clothing were not merely expressions of gratitude for material assistance. They were tears of recognition that the world they had been taught to expect, a world of permanent enmity and endless conflict, was not the only possibility. They were tears of relief that defeat did not necessarily mean humiliation, that former enemies could become friends, that the future could be built on foundations of mutual aid rather than mutual destruction. Today, more than 7 decades later, the U.S.-Japan alliance stands as one of the most successful partnerships in international history. The economic, political, and security cooperation between the two nations has created prosperity and stability throughout the Pacific region. But the roots of that alliance can be traced to moments like that October afternoon in 1946, when American women demonstrated that victory could be generous rather than vengeful, that former enemies could choose friendship over fear. The clothing that made Japanese women cry would eventually wear out and be replaced. The administrative building where the distribution took place would be demolished and forgotten. The individual participants would age and pass away, their personal stories absorbed into the broader historical narrative. But the principle they demonstrated, that human kindness can transcend political boundaries and transform international relations, would endure as a testament to the possibility of peace in a world too often defined by conflict. In a small box in a Tokyo museum, a single green wool dress is preserved as an artifact of the occupation period. The label indicates it was donated by an American woman from Cleveland, and received by a Japanese woman in Tokyo in October 1946. Visitors who examine this simple garment often wonder about the personal stories behind it. The American woman who gave it away, the Japanese woman who received it, the moment of human connection that transcended the bitter divisions of war. The dress itself is unremarkable, the kind of practical outfit that filled women's closets throughout 1940s America. But in the context of post-war Japan, it represented something revolutionary. The idea that former enemies could become friends through the simple act of sharing what they had with those who had less. The legacy of that afternoon would extend far beyond the individuals who participated in it. The Japanese women who received American clothing would raise children who grew up understanding that international conflicts could end in friendship rather than perpetual enmity. The American women who donated clothing would return home with stories of grateful recipients that challenged stereotypes and prejudices. The personal connections forged through these simple exchanges would create networks of understanding that would prove more durable than formal treaties or military alliances. And so, in the end, the story of Japanese women crying over American clothing becomes something more than a footnote to the history of post-war reconstruction. It becomes a testament to the power of human kindness to transform enemies into friends, to the possibility that generosity can triumph over vengeance, to the simple truth that sharing what we have with those who have less is not just charity, but an investment in the kind of world we want our children to inherit. In a century marked by 2 world wars and countless smaller conflicts, it stands as proof that peace is not just the absence of war, but the presence of active goodwill between former enemies. The tears shed on that October afternoon in 1946 were tears of transformation, the transformation of individual women, of international relationships, and ultimately of the possibility for peace in a world too often defined by conflict. They remind us that history is not just made by presidents and generals, by treaties and battles, but by ordinary people choosing kindness over cruelty, generosity over revenge, hope over despair. In the simple act of giving clothing to former enemies, American women demonstrated that victory need not be vindictive, that strength can be gentle, that the greatest conquests are often achieved not through force but through friendship. The administrative building is silent now, its windows dark, its purpose long since fulfilled. But somewhere in the archives of memory, preserved in family stories passed down through generations, the echo of that afternoon remains. The sound of women crying not from sorrow but from joy, not from defeat but from the discovery that former enemies can become friends, that the divisions that seem so permanent can dissolve in the face of simple human kindness. It is a sound that reminds us across the decades that peace is always possible for those brave enough to choose compassion over conquest, understanding over hatred, love over fear.